Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavai Tejasvinavaditamastu ma vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om Peace, Peace, Peace. And good evening. And I hope you all had a joyous Palaharani Kali Puja, the spring celebration of the mother aspect. And we are reading from the complete works of Swami Ramakrishnananda, one of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. We're going to start his chapter on, is a belief in transmigration consistent with reasoning? Now, I've heard most people, in fact, I find it very difficult to find a difference between transmigration and reincarnation, but I think there are some philosophers that say there are some technical differences. Let's see if he goes into that or if he's just using it as synonymous with reincarnation. All right, let's begin.
Is a belief in transmigration consistent with the reasoning? Every effect must have a cause. It's a universal belief based upon observation and experiment. Something can never come out of nothing. People there are who hold that in the beginning there was nothing but one God, one without a second, and that by him all this universe has been created. And that although he is one without a second, still he is the Father of all varieties. That although there is no variety in him, who is one only, yet through his all-powerful will, variety, which did not exist, came into existence. And hence that something has come out of nothing. These people labor under a great mistake when they hold such an abnormal view, for they contradict themselves. They have unfortunately no power to comprehend the real meaning of what they say. But when they say that God has created all this through his all-powerful will, they supply the God with a will, which can do all. Can we imagine a man teaching Shakespeare who has not learnt the English language at all? The very fact that he is able to teach Shakespeare shows that he is not only the master of the English language, but has deeply studied the dramatist beforehand. No work can be done by any being here unless he has already fully qualified himself for it. Human mind can never reasonably believe that an idiot has invented a new machine which requires the skill and energy of a great man of genius for its construction. So when we say that God has created the universe through his almighty nature, thereby we've already assumed that in that nature of God, the necessary qualifications which are necessary for creating, preserving, and destroying are already there. The atoms which are necessary for bringing into manifestation all the innumerable natural phenomena which people infinite space through eternity are merely distinct, invisible, and subtle entities before their state of manifestation into phenomena.
Well, this paragraph goes on forever, so I'll take a short break and I'll make a couple comments. Just keep your finger in the spot so we know where we are. So, as our philosopher John Dobson used to say, he visited the center for probably a good 3 or 4 decades and gave lectures in science and Vedanta, and he used to criticize the Big Bang model about trying to get something out of nothing. And so he would say that what we should be looking at is that this what's behind this universe is beyond space and beyond time. So it's infinite and undivided and unchanging. If you're beyond space, you're not divided and you're not finite. And if you're beyond change, then on time, then you're changeless. And he says infinite, undivided, and unchanging is a long way from nothing. So in Vedanta, we get this universe out of Brahman, which is the infinite, undivided, unchanging, and within it is the power of Maya to manifest a universe. So the idea is that everything is existing in there in seed form. It doesn't have to be created out of nothing. It's already part of Brahman's nature. And of course, in Shankara's view, it's an apparent universe. So it's something that we're observing. And so it's not exactly the way we see it. We see it as this this universe. It has all these different things in it, multiplicities. So we don't see it that way. We don't see Brahman the way it really is. But Brahman has that power to produce this sort of magic show like universe. All right, let's see how he continues here.
So in their primal state, they remain latent and unmanifested, and the will of God breaks open the shell of their latency and manifests them into innumerable kinds of form, touch, taste, smell, and sound, which constitute the entire cosmos. These unmanifested atoms are what we call the nature of God, and the nature of man is in no way separate from him, since all his activities, either physical or mental, constitute the living and manifested man having name and form. Similarly, the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer of the universe is in no way separate from the power of creation, preservation, and destruction, which constitute his nature. If you hold that God is even separate from his almighty nature, I will only tell you that it is not the idea of God which is in vogue amongst all classes of people. That is only the monopoly of the Upanishadic sages of India. For the ordinary human mind, nay, for human mind in general, it is simply incomprehensible, being beyond all thought and language.
All right, time for another pause. Yeah, this is definitely reminding me of all the different things that John Dobson used to remind us of. So he talks here about how the here, by the will of God, breaks open the shell of their latency and manifests them into innumerable kinds of form, touch, taste, smell, and sound, which constitute the entire cosmos. He's actually making a reference here to the 5 elements of antiquity. And in the Sanskrit, it starts with akasha, which really should be translated as space, and it's associated with your ear. And it doesn't mean it's associated with your sense of hearing, but your sense of balance. So it's referring to the force of gravity. And then akasha, after akasha comes vayu. Through gravity, things fall together. And when they fall together, they move. And so vayu is the motion of the wind. It's not air, it's wind. And it refers to the motion or the energy of wind, the kinetic energy. It's symbolic for kinetic energy. Then, as things fall together by gravity and motion, the motion then gets turned into radiation, because it falls together and gets hot and forms stars, and the stars radiate and shine. And so the energy has gone from gravity to kinetic energy to radiation. And then the last 2 are Ap and Prithivi, which stand for water and earth, which are symbolic for electricity and magnetism. Of course, the earth is just a big magnetic a magnet. It's got a magnetic pole, the North Pole and the South Pole. And the electricity, that's a little subtle, but water, of course, is a polar molecule. It has a negative end and a positive end. And so it's symbolic of electricity. And it's associated with the tongue. And the tongue tastes things that are sour, and sour things are acids, and acids are nothing but things that have protons, raw hydrogen. H plus is the chemical symbol for hydrogen. So in this way, we have, the nose is associated with the earth, and that's because your sense of smell depends on the way molecules are shaped, which depends on their magnetic dipole moments inside the molecules. So this really does create the universe, and it's out of these 5 things. It's the reason we have 5 sense organs, is we have these 5 energies, and the whole universe is made up of energy. E equals mc squared, so you've got the whole universe coming into energy. The mass is its energy. It's not something else. The matter that you see is its energy. So let's see, what else was I going to say here? Yeah, so nothing can be separate from God in this view, because everything is Brahman. Everything is Brahman, and it's manifesting as this universe. So everything that we see, including ourselves and everyone you meet, is Brahman in disguise. And some of us wear the disguise better than others. So, and our goal in spiritual life is to try to see through the disguise and make sure that we recognize the Brahman within ourselves and the Brahman within all creatures. All right, so let's continue here.
These 8 are my 8 different natures, says Bhagavan Sri Krishna. The earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, egoism, and intellect. Such a concrete God is what every human mind can comprehend. And what is beyond this idea is also beyond all idea of creation, preservation, and destruction, beyond all idea of space, time, and causation. We are not dealing with that supreme entity, the changeless one, whom the sages call Brahman. We are now dealing with the popular idea of God. The Hebrew and the Christian scriptures runs thus: in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Genesis 11, 2, 3. In the beginning was
Genesis
the Word.
1, 1, 2, 3, I think. Yeah, that's a Roman numeral 1.
Oh.
Okay.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The same was in the beginning with God, and all things were made by him. And without him was not anything made that was made in him. Was life, and the life was the life of man. St. John 1, verses 1, 2, 3, 4. These 2 passages in the Hebrew and Christian scripture give us no clue to conclude that something has come out of nothing, since we can get the most rational explanation by making all the laws subservient to God's infinite and all-powerful will, as we have just now seen. For what are atoms? They are the invisible and most subtle particles of matter. Have they any form or magnitude? Well, they must have. Otherwise, how is it possible for them to bring forth a form by their union? Forms only can bring forth forms. As we have seen no form here, which is not liable to change, so it is but logical to conclude that an atomic form, however subtle and invisible that may be, it must be liable to change.
Of course, now he's talking probably in the first decade of the 20th century, so he doesn't have the benefit of a lot of the modern physics. But he's right in his opinion of these passages in the Bible. There's nothing that says it's coming out of nothing. And it's interesting that the Vedas have a very similar passage about the creation of the world coming out of a primordial darkness and so forth. And it's very interesting that the idea of light is brought in here, because light is what separates time and space. If you look at Einstein's equations, Einstein was troubled by his relativity theory, in that it solved a lot of measurement problems, but it led to the rather peculiar conclusion that everybody's opinion of things was different. And he thought that there must be something that was objective in the universe. He wanted to get an objective universe out of his physics, and that's difficult if everybody's got a different measurement going on. And so he looked for some combination of space and time that everybody could agree on. And what he came up with was the separation in space-time, which he said was equal to the square root of the separation in space minus the separation in time. But the interesting thing about that equation is that it implies that since you measure distances in light units, like light years or light minutes and so forth, and you measure time in units of time, the units cancel out when your light is leaving one thing and approaching and reaching you. So in other words, the light of the sun leaves the sun, and then you receive it in your eyeball and you see the light from the sun. And so you put the distance from here to the sun in there as 8.5 or 8 1/3 light minutes, and then you put 8 1/3 minutes in there and you square both of them, you get 0. So it says that the separation between you and everything you see is 0. Well, that implies a lovely oneness of the universe. We see it all spaced out in space by seeing it backward in time. We don't see the sun now, we see it 8 1/3 minutes ago. We don't see the moon now, we see it 1 1/3 seconds ago. We don't see Jupiter now, we see it about an hour ago. We don't see anything now. You're not seeing me now, you're seeing it a few jiffies. A jiffy is the time it takes light to travel a centimeter. So those of you sitting out there are a few hundred centimeters away. It's an actual scientific term. Isn't that ridiculous? Scientists have a good sense of humor, I guess. And so we don't see anything now. We see it all backward in time so that we can see it spaced out. If we didn't see it that way, everything would be happening at once and in the same place, which in reality it is. Brahman is one, and everything is in oneness in Brahman. So that's the peculiar thing. And so let there be light really says, let's have space and time and we'll separate them with light. And it's interesting that many theologies of ancient cultures have similar ideas. The Egyptians, I think, call it a cry of light, and other kind of symbolic language like that. And so it's a very common thing that mystics experience, that this universe is somehow a interesting manifestation in terms of light separating us from other things. So, and everything is subject to change, because, as Shankar would say, Brahman is changeless, but since we're not seeing Brahman correctly, we have to see it as changing. And so that's why everything appears as changing. Now, they didn't know all the subtle things about the atom when he was probably giving this talk. But now, of course, we know that the atom can't really be pinned down. We know that the protons are somewhere in the center and the neutrons are in there with them, and then the electrons are somewhere around them. But what they're doing when we're not looking, we can't tell. All we can tell is that the probability of where we might find them. And so that's an interesting consequence of quantum mechanics, is that we don't have an actual universe, an objective universe. We have an apparent universe. When we look at it, we know what it's doing, sort of. Because Heisenberg says you're never going to be quite sure of what you see. Now, that's exactly what you'd expect from an apparitional universe. You wouldn't expect to be absolutely sure about anything. It's like mistaking the rope for a snake. You're never going to be sure what snake it is. You can just give that up. This universe is Brahman, and unless we see it as Brahman, we're going to be mistaking it for something else, and we're never going to be sure about it. And that's just the way it is. And so all of this really new physics points to this idea that this is an observable apparitional type universe coming from Brahman, which is the changeless, infinite, undivided. And it's also interesting that all sorts of things in our physics go to zero. If you added up all the angular momentum in the universe, it goes to zero, and all the momentum goes to zero, all the charge goes to zero, all the spin goes to zero. But energy does not go to zero. Energy is conserved, and it doesn't go to zero, and that's more symbolic of Brahman. Brahman doesn't disappear. Brahman is still there, even in the mistake. All right, so let's see how he puts it. But again, we have to give him a little scope here because he doesn't. He couldn't possibly put it in terms of modern physics because he didn't know any of it yet. He knows an amazing amount, and of course, by 1920, when he died, he died in 1908. He died in 1908, so he really didn't have the benefit. He would have had to be really up to date if he'd heard about Einstein in 1905. So, all right.
So it is a mere unwarranted hypothesis on our part to hold that atoms are changeless. Pure reasoning denies that property to it and says that no atom can be changeless. But the idea of change always depends upon a corresponding idea of changelessness. So the idea of matter must depend upon something that does not change. But is it not necessary that a changeless entity should depend upon a changing phenomena? As the phenomena may come and go, but the changeless space is eternally there. So whatever is changeless is independent, and whatever is changing is dependent upon an independent entity. God is independent and therefore unchangeable. But the desire or will in him is always changing. Hence, desire or will must be regarded as dependent upon the independent God. Atoms have just now been shown to be dependent and constantly changing, but being dull and dead, they cannot be the same as desire, which is mental action. There's also a fact that desire cannot exist independent of matter. So desire is indissolubly connected with matter or atoms. We've seen that desire and atoms are analogous in their character. And now we see that they are indisputably connected. So desire has two sides. The atoms constitute its material side, and the mind in itself constitutes its mental or spiritual side.
It's funny, when I studied chemistry, I always put it in sort of anthropomorphic terms. This atom likes this other atom, and this electron wants to get away from that electron, and it likes this proton, and so forth. And so it wants to complete this shell, and so forth. It's funny that I always looked at these things inside the atom as having desires to do things, and that really explained why the chemistry worked the way it did. And it's interesting also that since Brahman is the infinite, undivided, unchanging, we want to, our true nature is that, but since we don't see it that way, we keep yearning to be infinite, undivided, and unchanging. But of course, in this 3D world of Maya, or 4D if you want to take time in there too, we go after it looking for freedom, that's the infinite. We go after love, that's the undivided, and we go after peace, that's the changeless. And so we go after the infinite, undivided, and changing as freedom and love and peace. And of course, that's, if you study it, it's interesting if you read history and novels and so forth. People are going after those things in real life and in make-believe, and it tends to be frustrating. stories say they end it happily ever after, but the sequel won't say that. So going after those three things tends to be frustrating, and that's why we've all turned to spiritual practice, because we can get all three in one bailiwick called Brahman, or God, or our true nature, our divine infinite self. Oh, all right, let's go on.
Is when the sun shines, all transparent and smooth surfaces reflect the sun, and appear to be as so many little suns emitting heat and rays. Similarly, when the Spirit of God shines upon the myriads of sleeping and dull atoms, they take the form of will, thought, and feeling, become active and alive, and appear as good as God himself, not an independent and changeless God, but a God with infinite will, activity, and power. This is the idea of God which a human mind can well grasp, and which alone goes by the name of God. So an Orthodox Christian has no right to say that God has created this universe out of nothing, mindful of the true demands of his rational nature, which alone enable him to believe in a God. It's always a fact that there can never be any blind faith. That is a faith which has no previous reasoning behind to back it up.
Oh, yeah, there's another interesting thing. Of course, materialists try to get the consciousness out of matter, and they say it's an epiphenomenon of matter, that we have consciousness that manifests in our physical brain. But you have to remember that our sense of being comes through our sense organs. We experience ourselves as of being in this universe by the things we see, the things we hear, the things we touch, the things we taste, and the things we smell. And so our sense organs are feeding us all this. And we think that we're very sophisticated beings because we have all these sophisticated sense organs. But that fails to recognize that the sense organs that we have depend on the atoms and the molecules in all of those sense organs doing what they can do. They can sense gravity, electricity, kinetic energy, magnetism, and electricity. They can sense all those things, and that's why we have sense organs. If your retina didn't have atoms in it that were sensitive to photons, your eye wouldn't be able to do a thing. It depends on the atoms being able to respond to the photons. So consciousness is in this universe from the word go. It's not added on later as some afterthought. Oh, let's just add consciousness. No, it's in there from the word go because it's all one. It's all Brahman, and Brahman is conscious of itself. And it's created this universe, so it has another way of knowing itself through the sense organs. But it's sort of a false picture. It's like looking at yourself in a kaleidoscope, and you're seeing yourself all divided up into 6 or 8 different forms, depending on how many little mirrors are in that kaleidoscope. And so our sense organs present this rather interesting picture to us, but in reality, everything is one. All right, we actually got the end of a paragraph. Can you believe it? How long have we been going? Half an hour. We finally got the end of the paragraph. All right, paragraph 2. All right.
The reasoning must be there, however, perverse that may be, for no man, however dull, can never escape the hands of the two questions, how and why. He can never rest satisfied until they are answered. However wrongly it may be, reasoning is the especial characteristic of man, and those who overlook the rightful demand of such a divine nature that distinguishes them from the lower order of animals really bring themselves to that abject level, either willfully or unconsciously. So we should not do or say anything irrational.
Certainly that is an interesting observation, that we humans have this ability to reason and look at things in ways that we don't normally see animals doing. However, if you look closely at animal behavior, you find that there is a certain sense of reasoning. You know, there's this interesting story of an octopus that was in a museum, and the curators couldn't figure out who was taking all the, what was it, crabs or some sort of clams or something in another part of the museum. And so they put up security cameras, and they found that the octopus was climbing out of his tank and going over and taking what he wanted to eat and then going back into his tank. So they knew when to go. They knew not to go when everybody was around. They go when it's safe. And they've done experiments with other kinds of animals to show that they do have abilities to reason. And of course, they've trained mice to run mazes and so forth. And they actually find out that if they keep training and inbreeding the mice that they've trained, they learn faster and faster. So this ability to learn and to reason is innate in all creatures. And that's, we usually call it instinct when you see things in nature, but in some sense it's just this consciousness that's in there from the word go, that's manifesting to greater and greater extent. And by the time you get to us folks, that we have what seems to be this ability to be philosophers, and we have departments of philosophy that can argue endlessly with each other. All right.
Now let us try to find out, by means of reasoning, the proper scope and limit of reasoning itself. Reasoning is always limited by relativity. And beyond the idea of dual existence, relativity cannot go. That is, there must be at least two things or ideas upon which reasoning must be based. The seer and the seen must be there to see or know or reason. Otherwise, it cannot exist. Form, touch, taste, smell, and sound are its materials, and through its discriminative faculty, based upon its relative nature, it always tries to classify them into the duals, right or wrong, good or bad, pleasurable or painful, hot or cold, and so forth. Hence, it can never go beyond the five senses. And when it does so, it ceases to exist. For the senses are the gateways of all knowledge, and all knowledge is merely the outcome of reasoning, which only comes into existence by reaction when the mind has been acted upon by something external by finding its way through one of the senses. Hence, it is clear that reasoning can never live independent of the organisms. It is essentially corporal and never a simple thing, but always a compound. Therefore, whatever is cognized by the reasoning mind can never be that absolute unit existence, which is beyond the pale of reasoning. So we've now found out the proper scope and limit of our reasoning faculty or mind. It is always a relative entity and has nothing to do with absolute existence. It is always bound by space, time, and causation. When an external object enters through the gateway of one of the senses, passes through a system of waves, and thus reaches the brain center and acts upon the mind behind, a reaction takes place in the mind itself. And this reaction is known as knowledge. We then become conscious of the thing, and then come discrimination and classification, which are brought out by the reasoning faculty. When reasoning has done its function, full knowledge of the thing comes, and we are said to know the thing.
Yeah, that's certainly the way we go about things. We're experiencing this world through the senses, and it's a dazzling array of multiplicity and differences. And so we want to try to understand them. And so let's just take like one example, biology. It looks at all the different organisms around the universe, and it notices that some of them have wings and fly, and some of them have scales and crawl around with 4 legs, and some of them don't have legs and wither around, and so forth and so on. So then we classify them as different kinds of animals, birds and reptiles and amphibians and so forth. And then we subcategorize them. We find some of them live this way and that way. So we keep divvying it up, divvying it up, divvying it up, and then we find species and subspecies, and we find which ones can interbreed and which ones can't. And then we do the same thing with plants, but with plants we can try to interbreed things that weren't meant to interbreed, and we get interesting hybrids and so forth. So we kind of start with the vast array, and then we try to divvy it up, but then we try to look at it as larger and larger wholes, and we try to organize things into larger and larger groups in order to understand what we're seeing. And we find that we can get greater understanding when we start looking at systems of organisms. How does the organism fit into its environment and so forth? So our knowledge seems to go in both ways. First, we keep divvying it up, divvying it up, divvying it up, and then we have to try to broaden our scope, broaden our scope, broaden our scope. It's like doctors. They specialize and specialize and specialize, and then now they have a new specialty called general medicine. It's a specialty. It's general medicine. All right, so that's the way knowledge goes. And of course, it's a consequence of the original split. If you don't see, if you're not experiencing the oneness of Brahman, and you're experiencing subject and object. So if you have the subject-object split, then you have the process of knowing. So the split into subject and object gives rise to this process of knowing, which is what now comes up as reasoning in the as we develop into our higher and higher organisms. All right.
All these considerations show that true knowledge of a thing altogether depends upon correct mode of reasoning, which in its turn depends upon the perfect tone and order of our organism, as well as the unimpeded and clear contact of the organs with their objects. So direct perception or experience is the only source of our knowledge. Such a knowledge, once got, remains garnered within a certain receptacle in us we call memory. This memory, again, enables us to perceive things through another process of reasoning, which we call inference. Experience has shown us that wherever there is fire, there is smoke. We retain this fact in our memory, and thus whenever we see smoke afterwards, it is natural for us to conclude that there is fire behind it. This memory is helped to infer by an innate belief in the uniformity of the law of nature in ourselves. There's another source of knowledge which is virtually as good as direct perception itself, which is not of an ordinary human being with 5 senses, but of some superhuman beings who are fortunate to possess more senses than 5. We have no right to disbelieve them until we practically prove their falsity by trying to develop that sense in ourselves through the very processes which enabled them to develop that sense. The blind man who cannot see that there is a great pit before him on his way will be the more blind if he does not believe in the man who sees the pit and warns him about it. For by not believing, the poor fellow is sure to fall down into the pit and break his limbs.
And of course, this delves into the realm of epistemology, the study of how we know things. And we all know things, again, through the sense organs, but not just the sense organs, through our experience and our previous experience in categorizing things and understanding things. So we tend to jump to conclusions when we see a new phenomenon and try to stick it into one of the categories that we're familiar with. And of course, that can sometimes lead to problems. Of course, that's where prejudice comes up. If you have very limited experience of people from other cultures and other races and other religions, and then you meet one of them in a difficult situation or an awkward situation or an unpleasant situation, then you might make the incorrect inference that somebody that's different from you always is like that. And so you end up developing prejudices, which of course is not at all the case. You have to get a broader understanding of people to really understand them. And you have to know the culture that they're coming from. What experiences have they had in their life? How does their language influence how they understand things? English is a very diverse language. It has a great number of words with subtle shades of meaning for roughly the same thing, compared to, say, a language like French, which doesn't have that many words. We have a lot more words in English than the French have. But then you have examples, and I'm sure you've heard this, that the Eskimos have multiple names for ice because they experience ice all the time, and so they have different names of ice for different situations and different forms, which aren't terribly useful to us because we don't run into it very much. We're not living in the Arctic region. So our language develops according to our circumstances. And of course, Sanskrit is a very interesting language and has a lot of subtleties, and you can do a lot of subtle things with the meaning of words in Sanskrit. And it's a wonderful language for philosophy. But of course, if you don't speak Sanskrit, then it doesn't mean anything to you. You don't understand anything better in Sanskrit, even if it is a better language. So we have to keep all of these things in mind, that our knowledge is very dependent on our sense organs and very dependent on our previous experiences, what we've been taught, how we've been indoctrinated, and the language that we have that expresses it. Frequently, when you're studying a new subject, they start introducing all sorts of new terms. And when you're reading through them, they may kind of make sense to you. But as you read further, they keep using them, and you realize you don't have a firm grasp of what they're talking about because you didn't really grasp the meaning of all these new terms. And then you have to go back, and then you have to look in the glossary, and you have to re-educate yourself and get a firmer idea. So any field is like that. If you go into computer science or something, they've got all these new terms and that you're not familiar with, and you have to get yourself familiar with them, or you can't understand anything in the instructions or the textbooks. So knowledge is very dependent on this. It's relative knowledge, as he's pointing out. It's not absolute knowledge. Absolute knowledge is the knowledge you get from experiencing your true nature yourself by being God-realized or enlightened. Everything else is relative knowledge. We can read just part of this paragraph. He hasn't mentioned reincarnation or transmigration yet, has he? It's a long chapter. We've been reading quite a few very short sections, so this is a kind of a new phenomenon here, that this chapter goes on for quite a while. It's going to go on for another 15 pages. So let's just read a little bit more of this next paragraph, but it's a long one, so we won't finish it.
There is a great talk amongst some of our modern educated people against the kind of getting knowledge which they have named transcendental. That is, going beyond the cognition of their five senses and made it as good as unfit to be relied upon. These people will never care to see for themselves by practically taking trouble to go through these processes, which enable them to do so and invest them with the power of transcendental sight. Their obstinacy in holding light all such superhuman experiences will serve them nothing better than the obstinacy of the blind man in not believing about the existence of a pit on his way simply because he himself cannot see it. But fortunately, there is no such obstinate blind man in this world, for every blind man recognizes his own weakness and therefore is humble enough to ask the help of others.
All right. It's interesting, too, that our knowledge tends to depend on paradigms that we have. We have paradigms which are kind of models of the way we see the world working. And so we think we know how the world works, and we've developed this system of thinking about the way the world works, and we think we know how people think because perhaps that's the way we think, and so we think everybody thinks that way, or we've studied carefully how different people think, and so we've got it all figured out, and we have this paradigm. Science has paradigms. They have paradigms as to how the world works and how atoms work and so forth. And then as new information comes in, most of us are very pig-headed, and we don't like to change our paradigms, and we ignore the information that comes in that wants to change our paradigm. And it has to keep hitting us over the head until we realize that maybe our paradigm just isn't quite big enough or correct enough to include all the information that we're getting. We've certainly seen that in science. You know, at the end of the 1900s, everybody thought they had science almost sewed up. There were just a few little kinks that they didn't quite understand yet, and they were going to figure it all out. Newton had it right, and everything was according to Newton's laws. And then we had Darwin, and he had evolution, and he had explained all that. Just a few things we didn't understand. And then those things that we didn't understand just kept looming larger and larger, and the paradoxes were more and more ridiculous. And eventually we had to have the Einsteinian revolution with relativity, and then quantum mechanics and so forth. Who knows, we may have another paradigm shift later. I think we need a paradigm shift that says that the universe is this apparitional universe, that it's not an actual universe. And there's some scientists that are kind of coming around to that view. They don't put it in religious terms, they don't put it in terms of chakra, but they say that this is like a simulation, that they'll use terms that they're familiar with, and so that we're living in some sort of simulation or computer model or something. I don't think that's a very good analogy, but it's if you're used to computers, maybe that is a good analogy. So this is the way we learn things. And it's interesting, he's doing all of this to lead up to talking about reincarnation. And I did a lecture on reincarnation not too long ago, and it was interesting to see. They had all these documentaries on people who had kids that remembered past lives. And it was interesting to see the resistance of some of the parents that simply did not have that in their paradigm. And most of them admitted, you know, everyone in this town is, you know, a fundamentalist Christian. We're in the Bible Belt, or we're Baptist. I was raised Baptist. We don't have anything like this that's taught to us. And it's interesting, usually the women are the first ones to realize and shift. The men are more stubborn. There was one husband who still, after evidence after evidence after evidence that his son is remembering a past life, could not accept it. He just couldn't accept it. The problem was his little white kid had a remembrance of being a black woman in his previous life. And that was just too much for this poor guy to handle. So those are very interesting things. If you want to have an entertaining time, look those up on the internet. So we will close. We've gone a little over time today, so we will close with a chant. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.